historian of the Leventhal, and you're at actually the Boston Public Library. Is that right?
That's right. Well, I'm not there right now, unfortunately, physically. But yes, the Leventhal Education Center is a independent nonprofit that's in a long-term relationship with the Boston Public Library. And we care for and curate the library's collection of about 250,000 geographic objects: maps, atlases, globes, ephemera, games, geographic data, and all sorts of other material. And one of the things that's unique about the Leventhal Center is we have a permanent exhibition space in the Central Library at Copley Square. And we're also really committed to educational programs, public outreach, working with the public now through digital outreach, but when we're in person, through classes and workshops and other sorts of activities.
Well, that's great. You know, you folks have got a great little space there. If people aren't familiar with it, I encourage folks in their next visit to Boston to make a point of discovering the Leventhal. So who is the Leventhal in the name, the Leventhal Map Center?
So Norman B. Leventhal was a developer and philanthropist in Boston who had a lifelong love for the city itself, and especially for understanding the city through maps and geography. He was an important map collector and had a very influential collection of both early modern and Boston-focused cartography. And in 2004, he approached the Boston Public Library about partnering as a permanent home for his collection. And he, again, even more importantly, carrying on the work of understanding the city and region through map making. So Norman Leventhal established the center in 2004 with a gift, and the Leventhal family has continued to take an active role in the work that we do.
Well, that's great. I've attended a couple of the exhibitions. They've been really well done. And you also have something in the space that's incredibly charming. And I don't know that I've seen anywhere else. And those are those little nooks for children to be able to sit. They've got something at their height and so forth. It's really nicely done. So
yeah, thanks. But being in a public library, of course, we are, first of all, free to the public. And second of all, we really see ourselves as reaching a very broad audience, from school kids all the way up through scholars and researchers. And so we really strive to make our exhibitions and our material accessible to many different types of audiences and users.
Yeah, well, the Boston Public Library is certainly one of the great institutions, and it's so nice to have you with us tonight. You're right. I'm the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History, and we are excited to have with us tonight Garrett Nelson. He is the curator of maps and director of geographic scholarship at the Norman B. Leventhal Map and Education Center, which is located in the Boston Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us, Garrett.
Of course, a pleasure to be here.
Now, you've got to me, a very unusual background, but one that's ideally suited for what you're doing at the Leventhal. You want to just give us a quick sketch of that?
Sure. Like many geographers, I didn't get started studying geography. It's a field that doesn't exist in a lot of American universities for a whole complicated history. But as I went through my undergrad and my undergrad education, I started to realize there was this field out called geography that was interested in a lot of the questions that I was interested in. So I got my PhD in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm sort of split, half a historian and half a geographer, which means I'm really interested in understanding history and understanding the world through maps and through a kind of geographic disposition of thinking about the relationship between people and places.
You know, I think that anyone who loves history surely also loves maps. And so I think there's two main areas we should talk about tonight. Let's start with one that always amazes me when I look at old maps, and that is, how did they even create maps? In whether or not that was of an entire continent or of like some of the famous maps of Boston in, say, from 1775, 1776. How were those made?
So it's worth kind of unpacking that term they. How did they create maps? Millions of people have created things that are map-like throughout history. from specialized technical experts all the way through ordinary people scratching a kind of map on the back of an envelope or with a stick in the sand. The practice of cartography has varied considerably over the years, but at its core, it's about representing what people see in the world using signs and symbols. So, and I'm not sure if you're still there or not. I can't tell if it's just me here on the studio, but if it is, Lee, you're back.
There we go.
I felt a little lonely there for a minute.
I'll stay here.
As I was saying, the practice of cartography is essentially about making observations about the world and then projecting and representing those observations in, I don't want to say a piece of paper because it could be on a globe or on a piece of parchment or engraved in wood. But there are some key features that all sorts of cartography involves. One is measurements. And those can be as rudimentary as using a yardstick or as sophisticated as today a GPS. Another thing is the mathematical operations that are necessary to convert those measurements into something that we see on paper. So something as simple as scale, right? You divide something that's 1,000 feet by 1,000, and then it appears 1 foot on a map. And then there's, of course, an art of cartography too, using symbols and colors and illustrations and other forms of representation to tell a story about what we're seeing and to make it communicable to whoever's looking at that map.
Well, do you want to take an example? And again, the one that comes to mind, and I think many of our viewers may know, is say the 1775 or 1776 map of Boston that shows Boston Neck, surrounding areas. I think that shows the emplacements of certain forces and so forth. When we think about things like the shape of the land mass, the depths of the water and so forth, how were those things determined at that point?
Yeah, well, certainly during the American Revolution, military cartographers were doing a lot of the work of surveying and measuring. And of course, there's a very close relationship between military surveys, ordnance surveys, and the history of cartography. In the case of Boston, one of the most important sets of materials that we have at the BPL is a set of charts that runs up and down the Atlantic coast that was produced by the British Admiralty. What do you need to know if you're the British Admiralty? You need to know the soundings of harbors. You need to know where the travel lanes are to access a port. And you need to know where the fortified emplacements are along the coast. So that project was, the peak of technology for its day. The Google and the Apple of its day. They had some of the most, sustained investment of military surveying and military skill to produce these charts of the British Atlantic coast.
Well, interesting. So let's go then to the real focus of tonight and the focus of the exhibition, which I'll put it in my own words, essentially how to use maps as propaganda, how to use maps to convince people of something, not necessarily just represent the geographic landmass. Do you want to take us through kind of some of the maybe the framework for that and some of the examples that are in the exhibit, or maybe perhaps some that didn't make it into the exhibit just for space reasons, but we're able to talk about here?
Sure. So we have an exhibition up digitally right now. It was meant to open in person, which of course didn't happen because of the pandemic, but may still happen pending our ability to reopen. And the exhibition is called Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. And I'm glad, Lee, that you actually brought up the term propaganda right at the beginning, because one of the things that we're trying to do with this exhibition is actually think in a more complicated fashion than some maps being propagandistic and others being accurate and reliable and being able to kind of plop them into two categories. But instead about thinking about how the process of cartography is always about emphasizing some things and de-emphasizing others. And in that process, sometimes it's employed for obviously propagandistic purposes, but many other times it's not the intention of the cartographer to mislead or to lead or bring somebody to a kind of nefarious conclusion, but it might happen accidentally along the way. So we're thinking about this kind of slippery relationship of maps to the truth. How do maps tell us what we think we believe, what we ought to believe, and how do we take a more critical approach to looking at maps, both historical maps as well as maps in the present day, and trying to unpack what we're seeing in them. So actually, since you led earlier with the question of how do maps get made, I was talking a bit about measuring and projecting. One of the things that we talk about in Bending Lines is the fact that the globe, of course, is round. It's even more complicated than round. It's bumpy and oddly shaped. And maps are generally flat. So how do you go from a round globe to a flat map? Well, you have to distort it, right? There's no way to take a round globe, and even part of a round globe, and make it flat without introducing distortions into that process. So there's an example of the fact that every map is distorted in some way or another, simply because it has to quite literally flatten the complexities of reality onto a piece of paper. Can you bring my screen up, Lee? Or we lost
Carrie can maybe help us do that.
Excellent. All right. Perfect. So our digital exhibition, which I encourage listeners to visit when you get a chance at our website at leventhalmap.org. It's got zoomable maps and interactives. But I'll show you, for example, what some of the ways that projecting maps can lead us into some complicated conclusions. We have a whole section about geographic projections, including a really fun interactive example where you can imagine if the Earth was somebody's head, what would that look like as you project it into different map formats? And of course, cartographers from the early modern period on have been trying to figure out the best map projection that introduces the least amount of distortion. But there is no such thing. Every map is going to be distorted in some way or another. To kind of give a real-life historic example of that, what we're looking at here is a map that appeared in Time magazine, in Fortune magazine in 1941 by a cartographer, Richard Eames Harrison, who projected the Earth around the North Pole. So you're seeing the North Pole in the center there, and the globe is flattened out around the pole, which looks to us at first like a kind of odd, and certainly looked to people in 1940 who were unfamiliar with this projection as an odd, distorted way of looking at the globe. But what Harrison argued was this is actually a projection that helped people better understand the geography of global conflict at a time where we had airplanes and radio and long-distance communications and long-distance supply lines that had knit the world together into this global conflict. And so the projection, though it's distorted in some ways, Harrison argued was actually more appropriate for communicating the reality of what was happening in the 1940s. I'll compare that to another projection in a section about nationalism and imperialism. This is a map that may look more familiar, right? We're so used to seeing this kind of rectangular Mercator projection of the world that we think it's correct. We've seen it so many times, but there's no reason that this map is more or less distorted than the polar projection that we just looked at. What's especially interesting about this map is it seems so ordinary. It seems kind of banal. This is, just the world that we know, right? But it's produced by John Bartholomew, one of the great cartographers of the British Empire in the Victorian period. And what's interesting about this map is, of course, if you take a globe and flatten it out, you've got to cut the seams of the globe somewhere to be the edge. So if we go east here, we get to Australia and the Pacific Ocean, and you can see the red is colored the territories of the British Empire. And as we go west here, west, oh wait, there's Australia again, and there's India again. So the map maker has done a trick here, which is to unroll the globe more than one full time, so that we have two Australias, two Indias. Of course, Australia and India are big areas of red on this map because it's part of the British Empire. So it makes the British Empire look even more mighty and even more globe spanning than it really was. So both of those examples are cases where cartographers have taken something that they have to do, right? They have to make choices about projection and where do you center the map and where do you cut the edges of the globe. But they've used it to tell different stories. In Bartholomew's case, perhaps a more propagandistic one. In Harrison's case, one that certainly fit in with American ideas of what was going on in World War II, even though Harrison certainly did not consider himself a propagandist.
looking at that, just one comment, point taken about driving home the size of the empire. There actually is this clever aspect, though. It makes it easier for you to understand the relationship between Asia and the West Coast, right, Western United States, by seeing it in that manner, as opposed to, having them divided and so forth.
And that's exactly right. That's the ability to emphasize and communicate one thing while distorting another is a really important part of cartography, right? Cartographers have to choose to emphasize and de-emphasize different things in that sort of way. I'll show you one more great example of that, which is where we talk, oops, I'm going to the wrong section here. We talk about how the kind of language of visual symbolization was created. And this map was produced by one of the kind of founding fathers of information design, a French surveyor engineer named Charles Joseph Menard. And what this shows is cotton flows from North America and from the Middle East into Europe. And if you notice what Menard did here, the shapes of these European countries are totally distorted. Like, the British Isles are much bigger than they are in reality compared to the European mainland.
A quick question: can you kind of orient us? What's the blue? What's the?
Yeah. So I'm about to get to that. So what Menard really wanted to show with this map was not the shapes of different countries and continents, but he wanted to emphasize what was happening in terms of cotton importation to Europe as the American Civil War began. So here you're seeing blue is cotton flows from the Americas to Europe, and yellow is cotton flows mostly from British India. And then we get to 1861, you zoom out, you can see that Britain is starting to make up for the lack of access to American cotton markets as the Civil War picks up by substituting cotton from its colonies in India. And so what's important to communicate here, and Menard does it in other ways too, he's got this line graph here showing the volume of cotton imports, is he's distorting one feature in order to show something else. We're now really familiar with these types of flow maps or with line charts, but it's worth pointing out that these kinds of visual communications had to be invented, right? To somebody looking at this in the 1850s or 1860s, line graphs, flow maps were not common forms of visual communication. So it took somebody like Menard to create this symbolization, to tell the truth, to tell a story in a certain way.
And by the way, Garrett, you're taking us through an exhibit that, for folks who want to spend more time with these, is available online. Is that correct?
Yeah, we kind of scrambled to put this online, but what we've got is a really interactive, rich exhibition that's much more than just a kind of, like images and captions sort of website where you can get deeper into the maps, you can zoom in on them, you can read essays about them. I showed you one example of an interactive piece of the exhibition. So it's a really fun place to pretend like you're walking around our exhibit hall and exploring these materials.
We'll make sure that that's in the description so that people can check it out. So what other examples should we go through?
Well, did you want to ask any specific questions that you'd be more interested in? Of course, I can show you some of my favorite objects from the exhibition.
I think that's what we should do. Let's see the favorite object.
Great. Well, there's so much in the exhibition that is really interesting, but one of my favorite sections is 4 different examples of trying to sell land through map making. The first of those examples is John Smith's famous 17th century map of New England. Smith, of course, was one of the English explorers who first surveyed and mapped the New England coast. Smith didn't spend very much time in New England, despite proclaiming himself Admiral of New England, and he mostly became kind of a hype man for the area. He went back to England and he tried to convince people that they should emigrate to New England. This map is doing exactly that kind of work. So we've got this beautiful portrait of John Smith. This is actually the second state of the map, and John Smith got a more elaborate, beautiful beard in this version of the map. So that there's one case where the map is kind of doing a little bit of creative lying. But probably more importantly is that this map is dotted with all sorts of kind of European-like villages that didn't exist. So as we go up the coast here, this is present-day Maine. We've got towns like Dartmouth and Sandwich and Cambridge with these little illustrations of towns. And there were no towns that looked like that in the 1620s and 30s. There's also something that's, of course, missing from this map, and that's evidence of American Indian settlement. There are few illustrations of wigwams around the Charles River, but of course, Smith and the cartographers that he was working with were at pains to leave out the fact that other people were already living here. If you want to convince white people from Europe to emigrate and to settle here, you want to make it look like it's kind of a little European landscape in waiting, all ready for people to show up and occupy. If we go to the next map that's kind of selling land in Boston, we're jumping to a very different view of Boston and Massachusetts. This is in 1959. It appeared in the Greater Boston Business Magazine. And it's selling a different type of landscape. This yellow corridor here is the Route 128 Beltway around Boston, which was sold as kind of Silicon Valley of the East in the 1950s, a technology corridor, kind of economic opportunity growth zone. And it was called the Golden Semicircle. So certainly the choice of the color yellow here is meant to evoke riches. And it's rather than John Smith trying to sell this kind of European colonial landscape, now we're trying to sell suburban paradise of technological companies and suburban living that had become the kind of new gold rush at the time we're looking at here. A third map showing land speculation in the Boston area is this really gorgeous bird's eye view of a proposed subdevelopment in the Boston suburb of Dedham from the late 19th century. And there's so much that this map is doing, but the text is actually quite interesting as well, talking about seeing the accessibility of this new suburb. It's only 20 minutes from the city, 100 trains a day, these potential illustrations of this new streetcar suburb landscape on the edges of Boston. And what's especially fascinating here is this never existed. This was a map of an imagined landscape that the Fairbanks Park developers wanted people to believe would come into existence. Some of these parcels were laid out, but not nearly on the scale that's envisioned by this map. And then finally, we have a map selling California. And what I really love about this map is the way that its creators go out of their way to insist that they aren't lying. So I won't zoom all the way into all of the text here, but this map, which is from the early 20th century, does all of the tricks which cartographers try to do to prove their accuracy. It says we are nonpartisan. We have nothing to sell. We're not business people. We're not commercial agents. We're just good old geographers giving you the facts, giving you the numbers. And oh, by the way, the facts and numbers happen to say that California is a brilliant investment opportunity, and you should bring your business and you should bring yourselves out here as quickly as possible. So the ways that cartography is being used to sell something, but to hide the selling of it, right? To say, it's just the facts, folks. It's there's no spin here. How could there be spin? The map is just telling the truth.
And in that case, who is the sponsor?
So this map is produced by something called the California Development Board, which is many Western states had similar types of agencies that were funded by businesses and by the state government, essentially to promote the state. They're kind of the predecessors of like tourist boards or chambers of commerce today. But again, if you zoom in, it talks about how they employ geographic specialists and statistical specialists, experts. Of course, this is the early 20th century when expertise and scientific knowledge is very fashionable, seen as a reliable source of truth. And the people who produced this, the California Development Board, were certainly leaning on that sense of accuracy and expertise.
Do you have some examples of maps that were, so we talked about maps to convince somebody to perhaps move their residence, move themselves to another continent, move their business to another state, move their family, their household to another town. Are there some examples of maps for tourists?
Absolutely. One of maybe the most fun maps in this exhibition is about advertising, and it shows the close relationship between advertising and tourism. So this.
Let me just add one note. One of the folks watching said, "Boy, it'd be great if we could see those maps even larger." So we're going to go to a view which shows what's on your screen. I'll still be here. And is there a way to make this larger?
Well, I think I'm filling up pretty much your whole screen now at this point. And of course, the maps are zoomable, right? So that's one of the great things about the online exhibition is you can zoom right down to actually see the pen strokes on some of these maps. So again, I encourage people to spend time on the online exhibition where you can see these maps in their full high resolution glory.
Excellent. So what do we have here?
So this is a map that was produced by the Shell Oil Company to promote tourism in the American West. It's not a map of anywhere real, though on the back side of it, it tells you how you can get maps and you can get tour information from the Shell Oil Company. But this was produced by a pictorial artist, Don Bloodgood, who made quite a few maps around the middle of the 20th century, cartoon maps. And it's sort of just a stereotypical tourist landscape of the American road trip in the West. And it's dotted with Shell gas stations. So what do you do when you go out on your trip to the West? Well, of course, you stop at a Shell station and you get service there. There's a deep connection between road maps in the 20th century and oil companies. Oil companies produce maps for motorists to promote motoring because then they use their gas stations and they use their services. And so kind of the Great American Road Trip is constructed cartographically through materials like this. There's another tourist map we use to show just how closely related this idea of recreation and advertising are, which is this kind of souvenir map of Acapulco in Mexico. This map is just covered in brand names. So if I zoom in to any spot, what do we've got here? We've got Ritz, we've got Superior Beer, we've got Blanco, we've got American Express, we've got Normandy Restaurant. And again, we talk as much about what these maps leave out as what they include, right? So for the Western tourist, this is a map of fun, of luxury, of recreation, of all these international brand names, of the plane that got you here, and the credit card that you're going to be spending money on. Of course, Acapulco, like many, in fact, the majority of resort towns is full of service employees and service workers who are not living nearly as luxurious of an existence. But they're not on this map. There's some little gestures to the cultural landscape on the outskirts of the town, but that's about it. And so, is this map accurate? Well, the kind of shape of Acapulco Bay is not wrong. You could say that, it's kind of geographically faithful in that sense. But certainly, it's not telling a full picture if we wanted to actually know about who is living in Acapulco, what's its economy, what's its society like. We're seeing a very particular perspective on Acapulco in this map.
So do you have some examples of perhaps maps of the West, the American West, going back to perhaps the gold rush or the some of the big silver strikes and so forth? or just the settlements and the railroads going west?
Yeah, we actually just concluded an exhibition that touches on exactly those topics. The last show that we had in person was called America Transformed, and it was all about the United States in the 19th century, and especially the process of westward expansion. We don't really have any maps of the American West and of the land rush in this particular exhibition, just because there's so many different ways of persuading and distorting with maps here. But certainly that exhibition is also online, America Transformed. You can get to it from our website.
Excellent. And you, before we all got online, you and I talked about an exhibition that I was just so impressed by, maybe 4 years ago or so. And that was on mapping during the Revolutionary War. Remind us again of the name of that, and is any of that available online, or is that kind of before exhibits were being put online?
So that show is called We Are One. It's mapping the American Revolution, or mapping the road to revolution. I think it's actually before my time. So I was not at the Map Center when that was up. But it's a great exhibition. It is available in digital form, though, on our older digital exhibitions page, which is not quite as interactive and as rich. I will say that we have in our digital collections portfolio one of the best digital collections of American Revolutionary War era cartography, and we're in the process of making that repository even more engaging with new material about the Revolutionary War.
Well, that's great. The other thing we talked about, I think, is when we get History Camp figured out for 2021, we'll certainly come back and ask you if you want to be a part of that. So there was a map used in the promo political map of the U.S. and territories from 1888. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe you're talking about one from America Transformed. Can you tell me more about which one you're thinking of?
So, you know what? It may have been, okay. So that was actually a text message of, hey, saw this, ask about this. That may have been on us in terms of what we pulled for an image, maybe missing the fact that it was in the holdings of Leventhal, but perhaps not directly related to this. I'll see if I can get a little more information on that.
Well, certainly, I don't know exactly which one you're referring to, but you're talking about an electoral map?
Apparently.
Is this what we're looking at? Yes. Okay. So I thought you might have been referring to one of the big maps that was in our American Transformed exhibition, which is about the Imperial United States, showing U.S. land possessions outside of the continental borders. But now that I know that you're talking about an electoral map, this one that we see here. So one of the obvious cases where maps get used for persuasive purposes is in elections. We've just finished one of the great moments of map interest, which is every 4 years in the first 2 weeks of November. TVs are full of maps showing who is winning or has won different parts of the different races in an election. This is an early example of an election map from the late 19th century, showing the battleground of the presidential election. And we use this map in conjunction with a few others to show just how differently the cartographic language looked at this time. So we're now really familiar with this red map, red states, blue states map of presidential elections. But that way of showing elections really only goes back to around the year 2000, when a few news channels decided that Democrats would be blue and that Republicans would be red. Before then, cartographers had all sorts of different ways of showing which parties, which candidates were winning in a given state at any given time. And so this map, what's interesting is it shows not only who's winning the electoral vote, but who controls the state legislatures in each state, and other information like the number of electors and other data related to this election.
Got it. And
We show a number of other different electoral maps in the exhibition, including something that we have in the permanent collections, which is the original illustration of the gerrymander. So the gerrymander.
I was wondering if that's where you were headed.
Yeah, the gerrymander, of course, we all now know the term gerrymandering in terms of the kind of tricky drawing of electoral districts. But the original gerrymander was in Massachusetts. It was a state senate district in Essex County. And this is one of the broadsides where that now famous cartoon of Elbridge Gerry's salamander. It's actually Elbridge Gerry, though we've changed the pronunciation of it over time. We show not only the 1812 original gerrymander, but also an infographic of just how contorted and twisted modern districts are. So this is a map, or rather a chart, of every congressional district in the United States as of 2018, according to how contorted they are by a mathematical measure of twistedness. So you see the most kind of twisty districts up here on the upper left, and then the more kind of square rectilinear districts at the lower right. So we talk about how it's not just representing the results of elections on maps, but actually how borders and districts affect our electoral geography that show the relationship between map making and politics. I'll also note that we have, this is for the 2016 election, since this exhibition went up obviously before this November, but more than a dozen different ways of showing the same election in maps, depending whether you're scaling for population, whether you're using states or counties as your unit of analysis, how you're distorting the map to show different weights of population and electors. You can draw very different conclusions from these different maps, which is really central to what we're trying to show in the exhibition, namely that the choice that the cartographer makes about how to present data is going to affect what kind of conclusion you get from that. And data is not something that we think of as a strictly modern phenomenon, that, you know, data starts in 1980s or whatever. Cartographers and geographers have been using data, have been using information about the world since the birth of that discipline. Renaissance cartographers were incorporating data that was brought back from voyages of discovery. Classical era geographers were using data about the sun's angles to make the world maps of that time. So thinking about how geographers take information and then plop it onto a map and help us to try to understand the world through that process is what we're trying to get at in Bending Lines.
That's a great example. I've seen some of those, and it's so helpful to take the same data set, right, and work with that to illustrate the various approaches and conclusions one would draw. Last question from me: is there a map presenting perhaps scientific information or something of that sort, trying to make some sort of claim, perhaps about a specific landmass or whatever?
Yeah, we talk a lot about the different forms of how to present statistical information in maps. So we have a whole section called How the Lines Get Bent. It talks about techniques in cartography. So section I showed you earlier about projection is included in that section. This map of counting of votes that we just looked at. But something like this, which is a 1928 census map from Tokyo. We now, again, are pretty familiar with this idea that different colored regions represent different variables, right? Different statistical quantities. But cartographers for years have struggled with how do you show quantities on a map. This is an early example, relatively early example of what we call a choropleth map, so coloring areas in to show different magnitudes. And this shows the density of population in central Tokyo. Your question about science is really relevant, though, because one of the, to me, the most interesting things that we did in this exhibition was we took a set of data about the state of Massachusetts that we curated, and we gave it to a half a dozen cartographers. And we asked them to give us 2 different maps that told competing stories out of the same data. So I'll just pick one of the examples. They're all really beautiful and interesting. But this map by a cartographer, Lauren Tierney, took information about open space in Massachusetts, and you can see what she did here to tell 2 different stories. Here, she's labeled the map, Western Massachusetts open space abounds, and she's colored every piece of land that has land use keyed as open land in green. So it makes Western Mass look like this really beautiful patchwork of open space. In the next map, it's titled Western Mass Closed to the Public. And here she's only shown public lands that don't have public access. So things like reservations or military bases or treatment plants, and emphasize that. And now we're making the conclusion that, oh, actually, a lot of the land of Western Massachusetts is off limits. It's the same data set, but it's symbolized differently, and it's got a different label on it, which leads you to a very different conclusion. And all of the maps in this section do exactly that sort of trick, where they take the same scientific information, but they spin it in different ways.
That's a great example.
All right, so what should we look for when we are evaluating whether a map is accurate or not?
So it's one of the key kind of skills that we want people to come away with when they look at bending lines, to not just see a map and say, oh, that looks like a shape I recognize, so therefore it must be accurate, but to think instead about how might this map be misleading, either intentionally or unintentionally. So one of the things that we've talked about is how do you go from data and observations about the world to symbols, right? So in the case of these maps that we're looking at right now, we might ask, okay, what data set was the cartographer using, and what did they choose to include? What did they choose to leave out from that data set? They had to choose some things and leave out others. But probably most importantly is thinking about the kind of goals of the cartographer, right? Who are they working for? What are they trying to communicate to you? What's their kind of social and political relationship to you? We talk a lot about trust as not being something that's kind of like perfectly come down from one person to another, but that's structured by all sorts of systems that create trust, that create belief, and for good reasons. We don't want people to leave this exhibition thinking, I can't trust any maps, every map is lying to me. But instead, to think about what sorts of institutions do we trust, what sorts of institutions are trustworthy, what sorts of map makers are trustworthy, and what are cases where we might put up a red flag to say, maybe this person is trying to sell me something, maybe this person is trying to get me to vote for someone, maybe this person is trying to get me to take political action, maybe this person is trying to get me to go to war. All of those kind of cases where there's a motivated purpose behind the map making are cases where we should think carefully about what's being shown and why.
All right, well, this has been a really interesting look at maps, and there's so much that goes into them, and you really do have to think about what you're looking at. So thank you so much. We are looking forward to a good conversation next week as well. So I hope you enjoyed this tonight. And of course, there is a link to the Leventhal Map Center in our chat, and you can go and check this out and play with those maps and learn a whole lot more there. Now, next week, our usual broadcast is on Thursday, but it's going to be on Tuesday because, of course, it's Thanksgiving. So we are going to have a special broadcast on Tuesday, and we will be speaking with Donna Curtin. She's the executive director of the Pilgrim Hall Museum, and she's going to talk to us about the Mayflower passengers and their first year here, which was a very, very challenging year. So that will be very interesting. And then in February, it's a little ways out, but on February 4th, we will have Linda Coombs, who is a Wampanoag elder, speaking with us about the Native American perspective of that same event. So we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Garrett, thank you so much for your time tonight. It was really a great look at maps.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
See everyone Tuesday.